Nick Petrie, welcome to the show.
Oh, thanks so much for having me, Patrick. I appreciate it.
You bet. So, reading your new book, the new Peter Ash novel, The Price You Pay, I was delighted to see a Mike Tyson quote at the beginning of your book. Everybody's got a plan until they're punched in the face. Why did you put that in there?
Well, that's sort of what happens in this book. So Peter Ash is the hero, and he's got his buddy Lewis, who is Peter calls the most dangerous man he's ever met. Um, and usually, what happens is Peter gets himself into trouble trying to help somebody, usually. And when things get too ugly for him to handle, he calls Lewis, and Lewis shows up. But in this book, I wanted to sort of turn the tables. So the book begins with Lewis needing Peter's help, and so and they learn something very early on where suddenly everything is turned upside down, and that's what I wanted that quote to reflect. That like you think your life is going along the way you want it to, and then suddenly, boom, it is not.
Very true. Just when you think everything's going along, yeah, then something will screw it up every time. But yeah, I really enjoyed seeing that in there. I'm like, oh, cool. That's one of my favorite quotes, without a doubt.
Me too. I have a whole kind of list of quotes, and I'm trying to, I sort of like, so with which ones are going to fit this book, or I'm
Okay.
reading something and something else comes up. So that's part of the fun for me is to think about some of that kind of stuff.
Okay. On the techie side here, where do you put those quotes? Do you have like a tablet, or do you put them on your phone, or do you have like special software for this, or what do you do?
Oh, I certainly don't have special software. They're kind of everywhere. Some of them are up on my wall. Some of them are, like the ones that I'm thinking about will end up at the top of the document. So I'll be 6 months into writing a book and I'll read something and I'll think, hey, that might fit. And so I'll put
Mm,
that at the top of the document. And by the time the book is done, there are anywhere from 4 to 8 quotes along with 25 possible titles. Just because I don't want to have to choose. I want to know kind of how
okay.
that book is going to turn out before I decide. And then my editor will have any number of opinions on all of the above.
Okay. Now, how soon into I didn't even think about this for the interview, but let's just go with the flow. How soon do you have the title for your book? Say you've got an idea for, for a story. Is that something you strive for like right away, or does it come to you as you're writing it, or how does that work?
Well, so it depends on the book for sure,
Hmm.
but the thing I think I have learned most recently is that is not to decide on a title, not to even give myself a working title because then I get too attached to it. So like my last book, I had a working title that I thought was, freaking genius.
Yeah.
And my editor's like, yeah, I don't even know what that means. Like that doesn't make any sense. And it just got, and we kind of had a thing about it because I was like, this is the title. And they're like, you know, we really don't think it should be the title. And technically, I have I don't really have final say. Most writers don't have final say on title.
Yeah.
So they are kind and we go back and forth and we have a conversation. They're not going to pick something I hate. Um, but sometimes it's a really long conversation. And this book we went back and forth probably 3 or 4 different occasions where at a certain point my editor was just like, yeah, we're not getting anywhere. Let's just keep working and we'll. So it's I don't know. It is the thing that I have the least confidence in my own ability to do.
Hmm.
Um, the let's see, I'm looking at my books right here. The two of the titles were kind of mine all along. So Burning Bright, I just sort of knew that was the title, and there's a quote at the beginning that it fits with. And The Runaway, I knew that was the title, but they had to be convinced. So they had all these other things, and I just said, here's how I think about it. And they finally kind of came back and said, actually, we talk to marketing. I mean, that's what happens. We talk to marketing, and
Okay.
marketing says, and there's all this other stuff, right? Like you have a title that you love that is commercial, right? It tells the reader what the book is.
Right.
But then 3 years ago, John Grisham uses it. So we're not going to use that title because if somebody searches for the title, guess whose book is always going to come up first, right? It's going to be John Grisham or Stephen King or who else
Sure.
is,
Sure.
any of those big fish. So it's a complicated process, and it's sort of an interesting sort of a learning curve for me, and that's kind of why I've sort of let go of it. I mean, I always, again, I have a whole bunch of titles, and when I send that manuscript off for the first time, I just move that list of titles all the way down to the bottom of the document. So I always have a kind of a note from my editor. Here are the things that I'm concerned about,
Mm,
and then here's my list of titles. And
gotcha.
they will veto all of them and say, how about this or how about that? Or they'll say, um, they'll take one and there'll be a tweak, a variation. I'm trying to think of one right now, and I don't think. Yeah, the breaker I wanted to call. I was thinking about makers, make or break, or makers and breakers or something.
Mm,
Um, and they wanted it. They said, that's a nonfiction, a piece of long form nonfiction about craftsmen or something. I'm like, well,
okay.
I guess I can see that.
Sure. Sure.
So it's a crazy thing that the weird things about being a working writer that would never occur to you before you get involved.
Right. Exactly. You're kind of walking that thin line where, you have that like creative part in you that, and again, sometimes you fall in love with a certain title or an idea, and it's like, well, okay, then there's the philosophy of, the title should, give the reader an idea at least of what the book is about. There's reader expectations. And then you have like Stephen King who can put down, X, Y, and Z and everybody's gonna buy it. So
Well, and it's good to be Stephen King. It's good to be
yes.
John Grisham. Those guys,
Yeah.
they worked hard and they're
Yep.
great writers, and they occupy a certain place in our universe. Um, but I don't know. I just like part of it is that like I am really good at one part of this job, right? I'm pretty good at writing the novel. Uh, but I have a professional editor for a reason, right? This is
Sure.
something that
Yeah.
they can see things that I can't. They looking at it from a different perspective.
Sure.
Every editor I've ever worked with, I'm now on my fifth editor, has been crazy smart and super detail oriented
Mm,
and very good at their jobs.
sure. Sure.
And then the marketing department, I published through a Penguin Random House imprint called Putnam. They have a whole different sort of set of things that they think about. And again, it's super interesting to learn kind of the facets of their job and to know that I will never be smart enough to actually really understand, kind of what they do, especially all the internet related stuff has gotten so complex these days. It's
Oh yeah,
super interesting.
absolutely. Absolutely. So I was doing my homework on you, and you were being interviewed, and you said something about luck finds people who show up for work every day. Yeah, you strike me as a blue collar author. How true is
Well,
that? And can you
oh, I
kind of
think it's
explain it?
totally true. Well, if I mean, it's still a little weird for me to introduce myself as a writer. Somebody says, "What do you do for a living?" My instinct is to introduce myself as a carpenter because that's what I did for 15 years.
Mm,
I was a handyman, and then I was a general contractor, a remodeler, working on old houses, some historical houses. Um, and I had a cabinet shop, and I built custom furniture, and then we moved back to Milwaukee, and I started a home inspection business. So, which is, in theory, it's a profession. But I got dirty every day, and I would, go up on the roof in January and slide into every little crawl space I could fit my body into, and
right.
so I think of myself as kind of a blue collar guy.
Yeah,
Um,
that was the impression that I got, but luck finds people who show up for work every day. How does that translate into your writing, do you think?
well, there's a kind of a saying in visual artists talk about you just keep showing up. And I think that's really true. Not every day is going to be a day when you're a genius.
Yeah,
Some days I'm a total idiot, but I just know that if I show up for work and I'm in my office long enough and I don't allow myself to surf the web or check my email or, do any of those other distraction things, sooner or later something will show up. I go back a couple of days in my document, kind of what was I working on 2 days ago?
right.
And I just start scanning through. I read through and yeah, that word's probably not quite right. Or, am I going to reverse this clause? Or, that paragraph, there's way too much. I'm going to cut out these 4 sentences. And by the time I get down to the point where, um, I need to figure out what happens next, the machinery's lubricated, the coffee's kicked in, but none of that's going to happen if you know, sit in front of the TV or you go read a book or, I mean, I really believe that, writing a novel is a long process. My books are 90 to 125,000 words.
Wow. Okay. Is that
So,
before or after the cutting room floor?
oh, that's after. That's after.
So your rough drafts are what, about 150K?
Night rough, it's pretty close in.
Okay.
I when I turn something in, it's really pretty whittled down, because
Mm.
I go back through it so many times, and when I
Oh,
really
okay.
get stuck, I go all the way back to the beginning and I do that whole process, and it
Oh,
helps me
okay.
sort of see, some of the moves I had made as a writer. I forgot I mentioned this, so maybe this can get turned into that.
Yeah.
Or you see some of the language you use. Oh, I'm kind of using this sort of descriptive language, so maybe I can use that here. And those are things that, again, sort of, juice the machinery and get things going again. But by the
Gotcha.
time I get to the end, so like, most books, I stop that process somewhere between 20 and 15,000 words from the end. And I'm just racing toward the end because I know what's going to happen. I know kind of everything is sort of cooking, at least in theory. But when I get to that last paragraph, I only need about 2 weeks to go back through and kind of clean stuff up.
Mm,
There's all these sort of all caps notes that I leave in because I don't want to slow myself down. I don't want to lose momentum sometimes. So
sure.
it's like, go back and find the word for this, or, is this the right, detail, whatever. What's the name of that town? That kind of stuff that, like, again, you can get derailed so easily. So like I save those for, cloudy days when I haven't had enough sleep. And I'm like, okay, I can do some dumb stuff.
Sure.
And I'm still at work and I'm still accomplishing something.
Absolutely. See, I believe we make our own luck, and it's just not going to happen if your butt isn't in the chair. And that's like every successful author I've ever interviewed or talked to, there's some really basic stuff. And you, you can't have like a breakthrough. You can't write this awesome book or chapter or whatever if you're not trying, if you're not there doing it.
Yeah. There's an artist named Chuck Close, who's a painter, who his famous quote is that amateurs wait for inspiration, the professionals just show up and get to work.
Yes.
And I love that. I love that. And that's kind of the way I approach this.
Yeah. So, what's your definition of success?
I, it's a good question. I have been somebody, my wife criticizes me for this, and I think rightly so, because I'm always moving the goalposts.
Okay.
I have trouble sort of celebrating the victories.
Okay.
'Cause I'm always sort of moving on to the next thing. So, I wrote 3 books I couldn't get published, and every book I got a little farther along. So I wrote a book where I couldn't find an agent, but I got a couple of really nice rejection letters. And then I wrote another book and I found an agent who was a bad agent.
Mm,
And then I wrote another agent and I found an agent who was a good agent, and she's still my agent today. She couldn't sell that book because she was trying to sell it right as the Great Recession was crashing down upon us.
okay.
And big publishing was not interested in
Yeah.
buying anything from anybody they'd never heard of.
Right.
But so, I got a little farther along, and then it was like, holy crap, they want this book that became The Drifter. And, I leap, instead of sort of being, woohoo, I'm leaping ahead to, uh, oh, I want to be a national bestseller, or I want to make the New York Times list. I want, all this other stuff, as opposed to just sort of saying, okay, that's one more step. So that's a challenge for me. I mean, my wife and I were just talking about this, like what success means.
Yeah.
And honestly, at this point, it's to that I get to keep doing this for a living.
Mm. Okay.
I know enough people who have, their series get canceled. Um, they run into a problem and they can't finish that book. Um, and they have to go, they just sort of never pick it back up again, or they
Right.
can't, they lose heart.
Yes.
So I guess to me right now, that is what I am trying to think of as success, is to have every book be received well enough that my publisher would like to see another one.
That's good. So do you remember where you were and what you were doing when you scored your first big book deal and you thought to yourself, man, I could do this for a living?
I do. I was in Marquette, Michigan. I was with my wife and my son, and we had gone up to Pictured Rocks to go hiking. And we were supposed to go tent camping, but we made the mistake of going in mid-June when the mosquitoes are the size of dragonflies.
Oh God.
And that really visceral moment when it's almost like a claustrophobia where you can hear them everywhere around you and they're swarming
Yes.
around you
Oh
and you
yeah.
can't get. So we had one of those nights and we ended up in our tent eating cold food. Um, and the next day, well, it wasn't even the next day. My wife said, "Yeah, we're getting a cabin. We are not camping." So the next day, we got up, we found a cabin, and then the day after that, I had a phone appointment with my agent. So we went to Marquette because there's not great signal in the UP, or there wasn't then, that was 10 years ago.
Yeah.
Um, so we got a hotel room in Marquette, and my wife and my son went out for a walk, and I talked to one editor who said, we'd like to offer you this very small amount of money, and she proceeded to tell me all the things that were wrong with my book. And at one point I said, so I'm sorry, so why are you interested in this book?
Right.
And she said, well, I love the voice, but it's all a mess. It doesn't know whether it's a thriller or a mystery. She had all of this sort of technical stuff. And then I talked to another editor who offered me what seemed to be an outrageous amount of money and said, the book's nearly perfect. And I have a couple of little things.
Oh wow.
Yeah. So that was an easy decision, right?
Sure.
And that was the book that went on to be nominated for 6 awards and won three. So I like to think that I picked the right editor.
Yeah, I think you did. So how did you celebrate?
Oh, we went out for Mexican food. There may have been some excellent beer. We sat
Excellent.
on a deck. Oh, it was a beautiful summer day. The wind was blowing off Lake Superior. Um, and just sitting in the sun with my wife and son and just being like, holy crap, this is amazing.
That's awesome. I love to ask people that question that, have some, everybody's definition of success is different, but somebody who, was working a regular quote unquote job and then this happens, it's like, holy shit, look at
Yeah.
this is awesome. Just I love that kind of stuff. So that gives people hope, I think. It's like, okay, it's not just this vague, like obscure thing. And it's like it can happen.
No, the only difference between an unpublished author and a published author is time and effort. That I really do believe that. I believe that everybody has a good story to tell. Um, if it's not happening for you, start something else,
Right.
and read good books. I mean, that's how we really learn to be writers, right? Is to read really good books, read above yourself. And that's how I learned to read, or that's how I learned to write. Was I was looking at the books that I love,
Mm,
and I'm a big rereader, and so that also really helps me see structure and how characters are
okay.
developed. So there's a point at which I really, every year there's this exercise that I do where I take a book that really kind of knocked my socks off that year. So I've already read it once, and then I go back and I read it again, so I already know what happens. So then I basically write a beat line of
Mm,
everything that happens in that book. So every chapter gets three or four lines, and it's what's the point of view? How many pages is it? Because you want to know, I mean, that really helps with structure. Gee, how many pages, how many chapters between the time when point of view character number one shows up, and then point of view, character two shows up,
Sure.
or one shows up again, right? So how long can I go? What point will the reader forget?
Oh, okay.
Uh,
Yeah, yeah, yeah. That
so
makes
it's sort of some technical stuff like that, but you
yeah,
really do, take a book that really means a lot to you, that you're like, man, I wish I could write something this good, and take it apart, and you'll really see what the machinery is like. It's a really interesting exercise, and I learned so much from it.
very cool. So, we talked, you have previous jobs, you're a carpenter, a home inspector, all that kind of stuff. How do you think that and like life experiences molded you for a writer? I heard that you went backpacking in Iceland, which is totally cool.
I don't know. I think everybody has enough life experience by the time they're 15 years old to be able to write a novel. There's a great quote. Was it Chekhov who said that, all you have to do is walk by a soldier's barracks with the windows open, and you will know everything you need to know to write a great novel. I'm not sure that's quite enough, but
Right.
I mean, I do think you have to live a life. I mean, it does take a long time to learn to write a novel, but I also think it takes a long time to learn who you are, and to have a unique sense of the world, and to not be sort of parroting the things that you hear, or copying
Hmm.
the books that you love. Um, but for me, I mean, I think of myself as a working class guy, and my character is as well.
Sure.
I that's the world that he tends to move through for the most part.
Yeah.
And that's what being a soldier is like, just like it's what a cop is being like. And honestly, if you're a criminal, it's kind of the same thing.
Right, absolutely. What I see is, it's kind of hard for somebody who hasn't done a lot in life or has been sheltered, and then they're writing about some grandiose thing and it really pops out. It's like, ooh, you really missed the mark here, or whatever the case may be. What are what's your take, or what would you suggest to somebody that's a writer that is kind of wet behind the ears and hasn't had a lot of life experiences?
Go get
What?
a weird job.
Yeah,
Go get a job where you're going to meet a lot of people, and people are. I mean, if you want to be a crime writer, and go see what the world, the world is like, that you didn't come from. I mean,
that's
I know writers who became cops so that they could 20 years later write about it. You
what
know,
that's
I mean,
that.
I know writers who, Michael Connolly famously became, a crime journalist.
Mhm.
He had the cops beat for the LA Times because he wanted to write crime fiction. So I mean, that's a great way to sort of learn about the world. Get a nursing degree. Find a way to involve yourself in the world, that the things that you're interested in,
Yeah,
and dive into that,
right.
and things will come out of it.
When people have asked me, I said, you know what, go get a Joe job. Be a bartender, be a server. You're gonna learn a ton. Drive an Uber. Whatever the case.
Totally.
And start picking at people's brains. Do it with purpose. And before I was a cop, I mean, I worked at a 24-hour restaurant in Madison. I worked at IHOP. I was a manager.
I
Yeah.
bet you saw a lot.
Oh my God, did I ever? And then I sold cars for 4 years. I bartended. I've I've driven Ubers. I worked for an airline throwing bags, loading and unloading airplanes. It's like, and I always learned something about human nature, and then being a cop for 25 years in a big city, you're just like,
Oh yeah.
but I'm glad I did all that other stuff first because what did I learn? I learned how to talk to drunks when I was at IHOP. When it's 2 o'clock in the morning and you got some belligerent drunk, and it's like, okay, when I was a bartender, same thing. People
Right.
get stupid. And it's like, how am I going to diffuse the situation? How am I going to calm people down? And it's like, yeah, you just have to talk to them. But I wouldn't have that background unless I did all those other jobs.
Well, and it helps to be interested in human beings, right?
Yes.
I mean, all of the jobs that you just mentioned are jobs that require you to learn how to deal with other people and to be, you have to, in a way, really be curious about how people tick, what makes people work in order to, get them to do what you want them to do, in order to have them as customers, in order to, you know, to talk down a drunk or some wacko on the street or whatever, right?
Yep.
I think that's both of those are essential. But there are writers like the two that come to mind are Michael Corita and Greg Hurwitz, both of whom published their, let's see, both had books accepted for publication before they were out of college.
Hmm.
And one of those, I can't remember, I think it was Greg, whose book was published before he got out of college.
Wow.
But so those guys are the exception that prove the rule, right? Like
Sure.
Michael Corita became a small town reporter because he wanted to learn how to write and he wanted to see, he wanted a certain vision of the world. And Greg has done a whole bunch of different stuff. But for most people, the average novelist publishes their first book at the age of 44.
Yeah, that's
Right?
about right.
This is not a wonderkind, kind of deal unless you're really talented or really lucky.
Yeah. Yep. So, your main character, Peter Ash, is a Marine Corps vet with PTSD. How do you write that authentically without pissing people off when you're not a Marine Corps vet?
Well, so I was
How,
really nervous about that. So
yeah.
I never thought that first book would be published, right? I'd written three books I couldn't get published. I had, I'd gotten kind of slapped down hard on that last one in the crash, um, because they'd asked me for a revision, and by the time I returned it, Lehman Brothers had gone under and the world had changed, and my
Mm.
editor had that editor had gotten out of publishing entirely, and they were like, "Yeah, Nick, who?" Um, so I started like right. So I was not in the military. I don't come from my dad was in the Air Force, but this is not a military family, right?
Mm.
Um, and I started writing about vets because they were my clients.
Mm.
I was a carpenter and a remodeler, but I was also a home inspector in my later years. We moved back to Milwaukee. And so if you were buying a house, you would hire a guy like me to tell you what was wrong with it.
Right.
And I had all these guys who I realized were coming home after the surge.
Mm.
And some of them, you could tell were, they had a prosthetic limb or they had some scarring that you could see.
Right.
Um, and some had there was no visible damage, right? But I am a scholar of human beings, and you can tell when somebody's hurting. And I would never pry, but we'd be down in the basement, and I would, somebody's wearing an army T-shirt or has a tattoo, and I'll say, "So you're in the army?" And the funny thing about that role as a building inspector was that um, they were never going to see me again, right? They were never going to, if they bought another house, it was going to be the average Milwaukee uh, years in home ownership is 7 years, right? So like if they were going to hire me again, it wasn't going to be for on average 7 years. And I was not connected to their home life, their family, and I wasn't connected to their service family, right? I didn't serve with them.
Right.
I don't come from that, and so there are you can't talk about those kinds of experiences, right? So with your mom or your girlfriend, you can't talk about those guys that you killed and why it now feels wrong and kind of tortures you because you don't want to admit that and you don't want to burden them with that, right?
Right. Right.
And you don't want to share with your service family the fact that you feel like maybe we fucked up and maybe we shouldn't have been there to begin with, and I'm feeling shame and anger, and right, so all like, so you can't, how do you share those experiences, right? So it turned out that you share them with somebody like me.
Yeah, total stranger.
Yeah, yeah, and so
Absolutely. Yep.
we'd have 3 to 4 hours together, And we invariably were down in the basement, and the wife and the parents are upstairs measuring for, for the drapes or whatever.
Right.
And I'm looking at the furnace, and we start having this conversation, and this amazing stuff sort of comes out.
Mm.
And I didn't know that I was going to write a book about this. I just sort of fell in love with these young men and women, and kind of everything they'd been through and everything that they had given up, not knowing, having no idea what the consequences would be of the choice that they had made to sign up after 9/11. So I started, being a little more deliberate about talking to people. And I did a lot of reading, and I read a lot about post-traumatic stress. Um, and then I just sort of put everything I thought I had learned into that first book, The Drifter. And again, I never thought it would be published. And then it got picked up by Putnam. And then I don't know, it was like 3 weeks before it was going to come out, and I kind of freaked out. I was like, oh my God, like people might actually read this book and I'm a fraud.
Oh, jeez.
And, what am I gonna, what am I gonna say? And I had written, there's an afterword in that book where I really talk about sort of what that process was like, how I started writing about vets, and very clear
Yeah.
that I'm not a vet. I'm not trying to pretend, but I still had that kind of moment of real imposters syndrome. Um, and then the craziest thing happened, which is that veterans started coming out of the woodwork to talk to me because that book spoke to them.
Mm.
And I still, to this day, it's probably about every couple of weeks now, but I'll get something on the socials from a guy who says, I thought I was going crazy, and I had my gun in my mouth a couple of times, ready to end it, and then someone
Mm.
gave me your book. And I realized that I'm not crazy. I just have post-traumatic stress, and I got some help. And along with that note comes a picture of this person with his wife and his three little kids, full dress uniform. And it just gives me the chills to this day
Oh,
that
yeah.
like something that I wrote to work out something that I was thinking about, some emotion that I was having, can have that effect in the world. And it's become the biggest privilege of this whole weird career that I've got going, is that I get to keep having those conversations
Well, I would
with
think
people.
that's the definition of success. Just getting one of those emails or whatever, that's success.
Yeah, no, I'm with you. And it's easy to forget sometimes when you're gnashing your teeth about this or that, but at bottom it really is that simple.
Wow. That's amazing. So now that you're writing full time, is it tougher to keep deadlines and stay on task than when you didn't have so much free time?
But
Because, for me, I've written 9 books, and it was easier when I was working like 50, 60 hours a week.
that's a funny, you should ask that, because this is the book where I totally blew my deadline. I published a book a year for 7 years, and this book it took me two. I missed a year, and it, in part, it's just life got complicated, and this book in particular was a bigger challenge.
Mm.
But I think what's the expression about, like, if you go on a trip, no matter how big of a suitcase you take, you're always going to fill it.
Oh yeah, absolutely.
And it's the same with time, right?
Yep.
So, I wrote those first 5 books while I was running a business, or first 4 books while I was running a business. But it just got to be too much. Um, and now there's less stress in my life, but it does probably take me more hours to write a book than it used to, because I have more hours available.
Yeah, it's funny how that works. So
It is funny how that works.
marketing, the word that strikes fear into a lot of writers' hearts, especially the introverts out there. You know, a lot of writers are introverts and they don't want to put themselves out there. What's your strategy? How do you market your books?
Well, it's funny because, like, I had no idea that this was going to be a part of my job, right? So there, as an author, right? So I
Right.
think of, I sort of have a split personality, right? There's the writer who is by himself staring at his screen, talking to the characters in his head,
Yep.
and then there's the author, who goes to book events and has Zoom conversations and writes, uh, answers 5 questions for the Real Book Spy and that kind of stuff. And I, it, the first time I stood up in front of an audience to talk about my work, it was practically an out of body experience, right? Like I remember before, and I remember the end. I remember after it was over, but I have no recollection of what happened while I was giving my little talk. But that was a long time ago. I've gotten much more comfortable at it. But I don't know. I don't feel like there's a whole lot you can really do. Again, I'm lucky. I'm published by one of the big five, and they still actually buy plane tickets and pay for hotel rooms, and they send me on book tour,
Mm,
which is something that very few publishers really do anymore, unless you're a really big fish.
right.
So they believe in me and they want to put me out there, and that makes me one of the lucky few. But they I'm for them I'm out for 6 days, and that's it. And they've got the next author to do. So I end up um, kind of saying yes to everything else that comes along. I go to conferences. If somebody says, "Will you come to my book club in Kenosha?" Sure. Yeah, I'll take an evening and I'll go spend some time with you and I'll talk about what I do. And hopefully you will like what I do, and hopefully you will tell your friends. Um, because it is kind of it's a grassroots thing when you're
Yeah.
writing books. It really takes a while for things to accumulate. Again, unless you are just stupid lucky. Stupid lucky. And you know, sometimes it happens that way.
Right.
So, I'm not a big fan of social media, but I keep being told that that's one of the things I can actually do to remain in contact with my readers. And so I've sort of this year I kind of I don't know, I sort of tried to change my attitude, and I'm having more fun with it.
Good.
And I'm not I think you can't try that hard. I think you just have to try to be yourself.
Yeah, I think being genuine, there's a lot to that.
Yeah.
People can spot a phony a mile away. And and like you said, I think if you're humble, and I remember one of my first book signings, I was just like, okay, this is weird. All these people are coming to see me. Who the hell am I?
Yeah.
So
Yeah, for
that's a
sure.
very odd feeling, and it's very, but it's cool. It's you're like, wow, this is people are actually spending money, to buy my stuff. So hey, more power to them. That's really cool.
Yeah. Well, and whenever I have an event like that, I always make sure to thank people, because
Oh God,
there are
yes.
so many other things to do with your time than to come out on a Tuesday night.
Right.
Um, there are so many other things to spend your hard-earned money on. And so, I mean, I'm really grateful to everybody who is actually, I mean, certainly the people who buy books, but just the people who are interested in this world that I care about so much.
Sure. You betcha. Now, writing in a series, you have a long running series that's successful, the Peter Ash series. What are the positives and negatives of writing in a series for you?
Well, the positives are, like, by now I know those characters so well, so I know. I mean, they do keep surprising me, and that's part of the goal, is to sort of keep pushing things, so that they change, right? So the
Hmm.
relationships evolve and deepen, and the characters have to become a different version of themselves, because that's what we all do as people, right? I'm not the same
Right.
person I was last year or the year before. Um, so I mean, I think that's the easy part. And I sort of know the style. I really know what a Peter Ash novel is now, and I
Yeah.
and I try to subvert that. There's a saying, which I'm sure you know, um, in writing either series fiction or series television, right? It's that every book, every episode needs to be the same but different.
Yeah, absolutely.
And so the question I'm always asking myself with every new book, which is sort of how much of the same and how much different. And I tend to go with a little more different, because I don't want to be one of those writers where people pick up one of my books and gets halfway through and say, "Oh, I've read this before." I
Oh,
like that,
sure.
that. To me, that's always such a disappointing experience.
Yes.
So I want my books to stand out from each other. That's why the settings are always different. That's why Peter moves around a lot. Um, but in terms of what's hard, is that you do have to keep those characters evolving, and you do, by now. So this is the eighth book in this series. and starting another book, it's like, well, let's see. How about if it's this? And well, no, I did that in book two. How about if it's
Okay.
that? Oh, I did that in
Yeah.
book five. So you really have to work a little harder to find something that meets that still feels fresh, like something that you haven't done before.
Sure.
Um, I think to me that's the challenge, and I'm in awe of people who can just keep going. You know, they're 15 books in, they're 20 books in, and those books still feel, familiar, like those characters become old friends. That's the great thing
Sure.
about series fiction as a reader, right? Is it's a familiar and comfortable world to step into, even if
Yeah.
horrible things happen. But I'm in awe of people who have been doing it for 15 years or 20 years. And to me, that's the challenge going forward is sort of like, okay, I've gotten this far. What do I need to know? What do I need to learn in order to kind of get to the next, to sort of, find my way to the next place?
Okay. Now, for a new or newer writer, what's some of your advice that you would give, like best practices or maybe even like mistakes when it comes to writing in a series?
I think it depends who you are as a writer. So I don't, and actually a lot of the writers that I admire a lot don't really plan ahead. They like to me, I would never write a 5 book arc before I'd written book one, right? So
Okay, sure.
I think it's I mean, it's fine to think about it a little bit, but I talk to aspiring writers who are like, yeah, I'm planning this 5 book series and I know what happens in every book, and I've got a 45-page document about the arc and the characters. And my question is, well, how much of the first book have you written?
Yeah.
It becomes an excuse not to write the
Okay.
first book, right?
Gotcha.
So I'm a pantser, so I don't even outline.
Okay.
So that makes, it's probably a natural thing for me not to want to think 4 or 5 books ahead.
Right.
Um, but William Ken Kruger, who is an outliner, he never thinks past the book he's working on. CJ Box, who is a very disciplined guy, he's never missed a deadline. He doesn't really think past the book he's working on. Um, so I think that's part of it, and part of it is just to like it's gonna be hard. Like it's okay that it's hard. It's hard for everybody. It's hard for
Sure.
you. It's hard for me. It's hard for Stephen King, right? It's hard for John Grisham. It is a really difficult thing to do. So forgive yourself. Be kind to yourself. Have a little self-compassion, and keep moving forward. And remember that it doesn't have to be good the first time through. You just have to get through, right? I have a
Yeah.
thing up on my wall that says, just write a bad book. And that is my goal. When I begin a book, that is my goal, is to write a bad book.
Just write a bad. I'm writing this down. I love it. That might be the title for this episode. Just write a bad book. Sweet.
Because it won't be good unless it's bad first.
I get it. I totally get it. So I wanted to talk to you a little bit about like the techie stuff, the meat and potatoes. So yeah, I was going to ask plotter or pantser, you're a pantser. Is there any specific like software like Scrivener or Atticus, or do you just go Microsoft Word?
No, I'm Microsoft Word. It's what I learned to write on, frankly, and so
Okay.
I try not to invite complications. One of the things I'm pretty adamant about is to kind of keep my life as simple as possible.
Okay.
And I think, I mean, trying to write and publish a book a year is a serious endeavor. And so I've kind of whittled away things that, like, I still, I have friends, I have a life, I blah blah blah, but I don't have 12 hobbies. I'll tell you that much.
Sure.
Um, that's for me. It's a big, I don't, I love podcasts, but I don't listen to the news or a podcast until the end of my workday,
Okay.
because I wake up and I want my brain uncluttered. But when I wake up, I'm thinking about, what I'm going to work on today.
Yeah, I was going to
Okay,
ask
so
you, are you wake up at the crack of dawn kind of writer and you just like hunker down and just start hammering out the words right away, or?
morning is for sure the best time. It
Okay.
varies. I've had chunks in my life where I would get up and go for a long walk or go for a run first thing, and you get kind of energized and the blood
Yeah,
flowing. Come home, make a pot of coffee, eat some breakfast, carry the whole thing to the office, and go.
sure.
Um, I have I can't remember who. There's some some super famous writer um, talked about sometimes when the book isn't doing what you want it to do, you have to sneak up on it at an unexpected time. So I like that. So sometimes I'll be like, I'm just gonna set my alarm for really early, and I'm not gonna do any of that stuff. I'm gonna just like turn on the coffee, and within 15 minutes, I'm writing.
Sure.
That's what Mark Rainey does.
Okay.
Um, so I change things up because it's easy to get kind of stuck in a rut. It's easy to get complacent.
Gotcha. Now, when you're writing, do you listen to music?
I do. I have a
What's your play?
14-hour playlist with a
I was
couple
gonna
of
say, what
access
kind of
points.
music's on your playlist?
Mostly jazz and blues.
Okay.
No lyrics. Or there are some lyrics, but they're not in English.
Okay.
Um, it's Miles Davis, John Coltrane.
Mm, I have the same.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because I need something that is not too regular. So like if it's Jerry Lee Lewis, you can't help but sort of sing along to that stuff, right? It's
Right.
hard to sing along to
And
Miles
writing at the
Davis.
same time. Yeah.
Yeah.
Exactly.
So it's sort of Pavlovian. There's a point at which it's like I realize I'm hungry, and it's the same song is playing,
Sure.
right? Because I'm at that same point in my day, or it's right. Just time for another cup of coffee, and I know that because now it's whatever song is on.
Well, I got a question that I love asking writers like you who are fairly established, and is there any chance or anything in the horizon of any of your books getting optioned for movies, anything like that?
They have been optioned.
Okay.
Actually, this was the second time they got optioned. They were optioned very early, and then absolutely nothing happened.
Yeah.
And then they got optioned about 2 years ago. And then the writer's strike happened, and I sort of figured everything was dead. But then they just renewed the option. So I'm going to take that as good news. Even though to actually get something made, we have showrunners. There's a pilot script. It's out for sale in
Sweet.
theory right now. So I don't know where it is.
Now,
That's actually something on my list is to talk to my TV guy to see where we are.
when you're writing a story, do you have a specific actor or actress in mind for your specific characters?
I have before this series. I sort of did the book before, um, but I haven't really done that since. And uh, I get asked that question a fair amount, which is, what actor do you see
Yeah.
playing Peter Ash? And I am not in that world enough to really know.
Okay.
I mean, I watch TV. I like the movies like everybody else, but I don't kind of think about it in that way. And actually, I was talking to somebody the other day who told me that you really shouldn't announce who you saw as the actor, because if you say it too many times, nobody's going to be interested because it's
Gotcha.
supposed to be this guy. You don't want to
Okay.
offend anybody. So I thought that was sort of interesting.
Yeah, that's some authors are laser focused with that, and some are like what you're just saying now. I interviewed Jack Carr, and he's like, okay, Terminalist, it's gonna be Chris Pratt. He said, I knew it when I first started writing. I'm like, wow. And he says, Anton Fuqua, he's gonna be the director, and I'm like, and this is before he even had a deal.
Yeah.
The guy is that focused.
Well, Jack's a unique character for sure,
He is.
right? Um, and I think his aspirations are not. I mean, I think he had Hollywood aspirations from the start.
Yes.
Whereas for me, I've always wanted to be a novelist. And I know lots of people who have made the jump from novelist to Hollywood writer. And I think if you're a novelist, you want to move to Hollywood because that's where the money is. But I also know a whole bunch of screenwriters who became novelists because it's kind of hell being a Hollywood writer. A lot of stuff
Yeah.
doesn't get made. You have the,
Oh
you know,
yeah.
the suits are always telling you what to do. You have to work in this, uh, in a group of people. You don't get, it's never your vision.
Right.
So I've had enough of those conversations. I have enough friends who have been in that world that it's not that interesting to me. There was a point at which I actually had a conversation with these showrunners about, would they hire me to be in their room? And they said, well, we'd hire you to write an episode.
Hmm.
So I might, again, it'd be nice to try something new. Um, but I have way too much to do already without adding something else to my
Okay.
plate like that. So I ended up telling them, maybe next time, if we do, if it happens, if we make it to season two, maybe you guys would, take some time and patience and teach me how to do this a little bit.
Gotcha. So your newest book, The Price You Pay, the eighth book in the Peter Ash series, due out on February 6th. Yeah, can you tell us a little bit about the book without giving too much away?
Well, I think I was talking about this earlier, where the goal was to sort of have Peter and Lewis switch roles. Um, and usually Peter is the guy who's out helping somebody else, and he calls Lewis when he gets in trouble. And this is the book where Lewis gets in trouble,
Mm,
and Peter is the one that shows up to help him. And it's a book that readers have been asking me for really since the first book. Lewis is totally a fan favorite, in part because he's sort of this dark, mysterious character, but he's evolved a lot over the course of these books. And so I wanted to dive into him a little bit and to show some of his internal life and to show what his previous life had been. So we in this book we see what Lewis and his crew were doing,
okay.
and we see the cost of that on his soul. And we see the gratitude that he has to be living the life he's living now. He's reunited with his teenage girlfriend. They've gotten married. He's got these two boys that he's adopted and is now parenting. And suddenly, oh my, like he has something to really lose.
Okay.
And so
The stakes are high.
the stakes are high. And so
Yeah.
that was part of what I was trying to do, is to really make this a more personal book
Okay.
with very personal stakes, and to see how high I could make readers' shoulders climb with tension while
Okay.
certain scenes are unfolding.
Very cool. So when somebody is done reading either this book or some of your other books, well, let's go stick with this book that's coming out. How do you want people to feel when they're done reading this book? And
Oh, kind of.
is that a consideration when you're writing the book?
It's never a consideration in the process of writing the book. There's writing that last chapter is always a really interesting experience because I want people to feel, I mean, there has to be some release of all of this tension, right? So,
Right.
and I want you I don't ever want to tie everything up in a pretty pink bow, but I do want there to be some sense of resolution and some sense that the characters have come through this in some way or another. And sometimes they're all fine, sometimes they are badly damaged, depending on the book and what happens in it. But I just, you know I have read enough books with unsatisfying endings that I pay a lot of attention to the end.
Okay.
And I want the whole book to be working up to this one final cataclysmic scene, and then that last chapter to be this feeling of kind of release.
Gotcha. All right. You know what? I think that's a good place for us to stop this conversation.
All
Yeah.
right.
All right. So what's next for you?
I'm actually working on my first standalone book, which is both exciting and deeply terrifying. Um, about an ex-con named Bobby Cruikshank in the driftless region of Wisconsin, so rural Wisconsin. Um, and Bobby's doing his best to keep his life on the straight and narrow, but then his little brother Paul gets killed in a roadhouse parking lot.
Oh
And
boy.
Paul is 11 years younger, so he was almost like a son in a way
Mm,
to Bobby. And Paul was the good person Bobby could never quite manage to be.
gotcha.
And so when the sheriff's department can't, seems to think this is a random killing, Bobby really needs to, uh, for his own sake, figure out what happened to his little brother. And so that's the book I'm almost done with right now.
Sounds awesome. So where can people go to learn more about you and your books?
NickPetrie.com is always a good place to start.
Okay.
I am on the socials. I'm on Twitter at _ Nick Petrie _ Facebook, I am nick.petrie.author. That's my author page. I kind of have been neglecting my personal page.
Okay.
Um, and a little bit less on Instagram, but that's also _ Nick Petrie _
All right. Fantastic. Well, thank you so much for your time today. It's been a lot of fun.
Thanks, Patrick. I appreciate your interest, and I really enjoyed the conversation. Thank you.